far the most powerful political party in those Low Countries as well. We would expect to find fairly perhaps low levels of tolerance because of this more exclusionary sense of nationhood that's more ethnoculturally based. And also perhaps fairly low levels of civic equality, or an appreciation that citizens are equal irrespective of their ethnic and cultural backgrounds or social backgrounds or their gender. This kind of belief that citizens are equal is probably fairly poorly developed, or poorly developed, I would say, not as strongly developed as in other regimes. Maybe because of this more exclusionary sense of nationhood, perhaps also because of the more the predominance of fairly traditional views on gender roles. Then if we go to the social democratic regime, that is characterized by inclusion, solidarity, and equality. And therefore we would expect to find, and also again also a appreciation for the state. So then we would expect to find relatively high levels of appreciation for the state, high levels of engagement, high levels of political participation, actually high levels more or less throughout on all these dimensions, and all these components, I should say. And then turning to the post-communist civic culture, if we can call it civic culture, we would expect to find perhaps only fairly high levels of respect for authority and patriotism, but fairly low levels on these other dimensions because of the legacy of communism. There is literature, notably George Shupflin and Michler and Rose, who have argued that the communist experience has wiped out civil society and has made citizens very distrustful of both state institutions and also of their fellow citizens. And so this has then resulted in low levels of trust, low levels of engagement with public affairs, disengagement throughout. And this is then seen in combination with fairly exclusionary senses of nationhood. So with in which a nation is understood in ethnocultural terms. And that is then likely to lead to fairly low levels of tolerance, low levels of civic equality. So these are the expectations. So if citizenship regimes are reflected in civic attitudes, this is what we would expect. I then looked at, I used these data sources, so the European Value Survey, waves 2 to 5, to assess the durability of clusters of civic attitudes, and then the World Value Survey, the last wave, to assess whether regimes, if I can identify regimes of civic attitudes, whether they can also be seen at the global level. And these data sources have the benefit of having a wide coverage across time and across space. Across time, nearly 3 decades, and across space, yeah, the whole world. And they allow me to tap these components with these indicators. Now it has to be so. I found items, relative items, to tap these components in these data sources. But it has to be said that, of course, it's quite difficult to try to capture these components exactly with relevant items. So of course, it is always very important to try to capture these certain concepts as closely as possible with the items in a survey. Otherwise, your research does not have conceptual validity. So I tried to do that with the following items, and I could find several items for for 6 of these indicators, but for some I could only find a single item to represent them. I aggregated the responses to these items to create indicators at the national level. So let's say the percentage in a certain society saying that they trusted, that most people can be trusted. That's one very famous item. Or the mean of a certain population in let's say about interest in politics. So I created national level indicators, which I then standardized with a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. And then I created an index for those components where I had several items to draw on. The methods, I assigned countries to their hypothesized culture, and then I calculated the cultural means on the components to assess the hypothesized substance of the civic cultures. And I did this in relation to the international mean. So if scores higher than the international mean, I gave the value of plus or positive, and lower than the international mean, I gave them a negative value. I then used hierarchical cluster analysis to assess the hypothesized country membership of the civic cultures in Europe. And hierarchical cluster analysis, that's very good for case of a small n. So I only had at the European level just 25 observations or so, 25 countries. Hierarchical cluster analysis, a drawback is that it does not establish any kind of statistical cutoff points, but it does provide a very detailed overview of how, in this case, countries are clustering in terms of the internal cohesion of clusters and their external distinctiveness, and I'll show that in a minute. I then also employed two-step cluster analysis to assess whether European civic cultures can be identified at the global level. And the two-step cluster analysis is really suitable for data sets with a higher n, with more for more observations, and it allows you to identify an optimal cluster solution. Optimal in the sense of explaining a maximum amount of the variance with a minimum number of parameters using a so-called Bayes information criterion. So what do I find then? do I find civic cultures in Europe that coincide with the hypothesized civic cultures? And here you see a huge table with all kinds of intriguing colors. Basically, what these colors mean is that the dark green and light green values, that means that they are in line with expectation. And the dark green more so than the light green, because the dark green are values more than one standard deviation from the international mean, and the light green ones are less than one standard deviation from the international mean. And then the yellow color means values that are somewhat not in line with expectation, and the red ones mean very much not in line with expectation. So just to clarify this, to illustrate this, here we see, for instance, under liberal culture, we see under respect for authority, we see the values marked in red, because the values are higher than the international mean, and this is very much not according to expectation, because we would expect respect for authority to be much lower or relatively low in countries seen as having a liberal culture. By contrast, for instance, we see that in countries marked by or said to have a social democratic culture, we see that then they're under civic participation and civic equality, that these countries very much show the values that we expect them to have. So relatively high values on ethnic and racial tolerance, relatively high values on civic participation, and also relatively high values on trust. So overall, we can say that in terms of the substance, the values marked in green really are more numerous, are more than twice as numerous as the values marked in yellow and red. So there is a fair amount of support, I would say, for the idea of civic cultures content-wise. We can also see that the values remain rather stable across the years, and which also points to relatively enduring civic cultures, which is also supporting the hypotheses, which is also in line with expectation. Of course, there are always some changes that can be noted. For instance, on state involvement in the liberal culture, we see that it moves from yellow to dark green and then to light green. We also see some other changes somewhere, but on the whole, the patterns look rather stable. Then going to the country membership of civic cultures, and I'm keeping here an eye on the time. I'll try to go through the remaining slides a bit more quickly. Here we see also a fairly high amount of support for the idea of distinct civic cultures in terms of their country membership. We can identify a clear liberal cluster of countries composed of Great Britain, Ireland, and Northern Ireland. A Republican cluster composed of France, Italy, Spain, and Portugal. Belgium is somewhat an odd man out. On the other hand, if you look at, say, religion, Belgium is a Catholic country, so in that sense, it fits well within the other countries in this group. We also see a post-communist cluster of countries and a Scandinavian cluster of countries. And here we see, because I couldn't fit all these this output of a cluster analysis in one slide. Here we see the years 2008 2017. We see a fair amount of stability of these clusters. The only cluster that is conspicuously absent is a conservative cluster. We can't really identify any kind of conservative regime of civic culture. You see, the countries that are supposedly part of this regime are really scattered across. Notably, Germany is also changing. It's part of a post-communist cluster of countries, and then it changes in the later years to other groups of countries. We can further see that these country groupings are somewhat different in their internal cohesion and external distinctiveness. If we look at the liberal regime group, so the blue one, we see that it's actually internally very coherent, because at a very small step in the merging of countries, at the very initial step, they already merge together. But we see that in terms of their external distinctiveness, they're not so externally distinctive, because they already merge. For instance, here in 1999, if you can see my cursor on the screen, we can see that they merge already with the Republican group of countries at a fairly early stage. By contrast, we see that the post-communist group of countries is not internally coherent at all, it seems, because it seems to be composed of two sets of countries which merge only at a very late stage. So this group of countries does not have a great internal cohesion. Lastly, the Scandinavian group of countries, they do show up as a distinct cluster, not so much in terms of their internal cohesion, but in terms of their external distinctiveness, because only at a very late stage do they merge with all the other countries in the group in the data set. So they really stand out as a very distinctive set of countries. Yeah, these patterns hardly change. So there's also evidence that these regimes are fairly durable. In the last here in the last dendrogram, you won't find a liberal cluster of countries, but that's because Ireland and Northern Ireland are no longer part of the survey. Interestingly, we see there that Great Britain is joining the Netherlands and Germany as a group of countries, but that is of course not a group of countries that has been hypothesized by the literature. Let's then look at civic cultures at the global level. Do we see the same civic cultures emerging at the global level? No, not at all. We can only see two groups of countries. Western countries, marked in red here, and all other countries, marked in gray. So this whole idea of these distinct groups of countries at the European level, they cannot be seen at the global level. And then if we look at the substantive profile of these two clusters, what do we see? Well, we see that actually, so the country cluster 1, those are the Western countries. So the ones that were marked in red in the previous slide. And we see that actually on most indicators, these countries outperform, but have higher levels on these indicators than significantly higher levels than countries in the second cluster, as marked by these confidence intervals. So these are these bars that you see here are kind of means with their confidence intervals. So if the confidence intervals, these are the confidence intervals, if these do not overlap, and this is of course the case for, let's say, if we look at civic participation in red, if we compare the civic participation level in the country 1 cluster to that in the country 2 cluster, we see that the confidence intervals are not overlapping, and hence that they show a significantly different mean on this component. And so this means that, of course, there are also some components on which we find actually that there is not a significant difference. For instance, on patriotism and on respect for authority. So between these two country clusters, and on one dimension, on one component, on state involvement, it's actually the case that the country 2 clusters show a higher level. But I think, given that on the vast majority of the components, the country 1 cluster shows a higher level, this is suggesting that at the global level, civic culture perhaps is more like a one-dimensional set of values, and a dimension on which countries can be ranked in terms of showing a greater degree or smaller or lesser degree of support for civic culture. So at the global level, it seems that the findings are actually in line with Inglehart and Welzel's idea of civic culture as or in their terms, post-materialistic values as a one-dimensional set of values. So in conclusion, we can say that whether civic cultures emerge that correspond with citizenship regimes depends on one's vantage point. At the European level, there is evidence of distinct cultures in terms of country membership, substance, and durability. But at the global level, only 2 clusters are visible. A country of rich, mostly Protestant Western countries, and a cluster of all other countries. So it seems, and therefore, that the findings complement rather than challenge modernization theory as proposed by Inglehart and Welzel. They complement it by showing that if you go down one level, from the global level to the European level, then you can detect, we might say, different civic cultures that differ in kind and not only in degree. So we can then find civic cultures corresponding to these qualitatively different citizenship regimes. And it would therefore be interesting to see whether future research could examine whether similar cultures can be identified in other world regions, and whether such cultures then do emerge at the global level. And perhaps one interesting culture to examine here is the culture said to prevail in East Asia, so inspired by Confucianism and marked by, are said to be marked by high levels of respect for authority, high levels of respect for the elderly, a more collectivist kind of culture, an emphasis on social harmony and not on dissent, little appreciation for cultural diversity, but combining all of that with high levels of appreciation for education, So a belief that education can really can foster your can help you to improve yourself. So a strong belief in hard work and in meritocracy. So these are then, it will be interesting to see whether such a distinct group of beliefs and qualities can not only be seen in East Asia but also at the global level. Okay, I'm thanking you for your attention. I hope you found this an interesting presentation, and I'm looking out for your questions, which you will undoubtedly have.
Okay, thank you very much, Jan, for your interesting and I would say ambitious project that you presented us here. I'm waiting out for the questions that they are going to put in the chat. But in the meanwhile, I have also a couple of questions myself. The first one would be, how do you relate this research on citizenship regimes and your previous work with the social cohesion regimes? I was wondering whether this is a kind of a part maybe or one dimension of social cohesion, or is something totally different you're pointing at here, because I actually there are a lot of relationships between these both agendas, right?
Yes, yes, and yeah, this is a good question. The reason why I turned now to kind of citizenship regimes and then focusing particularly on attitudes was that in my previous work on social cohesion is really such an all-encompassing phenomenon that it not only includes attitudes but also things like at least in some understandings of social cohesion, also things like institutions and inequality and the crime rates, and therefore I wanted to kind of focus more on values and attitudes, and just to see if these are also clustering in qualitatively different ways, and if they then do so, if they correspond to these citizenship regimes, these theoretical, as it were, citizenship regimes, which appreciate different qualities in citizens. So that's actually the reason. And also I wanted to really focus now on the different qualitatively different clusters, and hence I really focused on regimes now. That's
okay.
Yeah.
And the second question would be, I mean, this relationship between these regimes and the attitudes, and I mean, since you have this time, I mean, data in different waves of time and the different surveys, and you show something that there are different, from what I understood, different cluster analysis for the different time periods, and you were comparing whether the structure was was the same or not. I was wondering whether this if you have some idea how to model these changes on time, because I would expect that if there is some regime, maybe the attitudes of the cluster would be appearing more clearly maybe in the last waves than in the previous ones. But I was wondering whether, I mean, apart from showing the descriptive clusters in each wave, whether maybe there's some kind of modeling strategy that you have thought of to this work.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and to have a more statistical modeling strategy that could give me more certainty as to whether the continuities that I see are statistically significant or so. That's a good point, and I haven't looked into that in terms of, say, the specific statistical analysis that I could use for that. There may be things that could be done with applying perhaps some kind of multi-group or perhaps some kind of latent class analysis, and then simply just pooling all the data of the different waves together, and then see if the same groups emerge, something along those lines, maybe. Well, maybe you can help me there. If you have suggestions for statistical analysis that I could do?
Yeah, maybe I was thinking in the same way you mentioned, in some maybe latent class analysis, because they have also this longitudinal approach, which is latent transition analysis, where you can see whether, I mean, if the same cases remain the same a long time, or maybe they are changing cluster. I mean, it would be interesting to see maybe in a longitudinal way whether some country in this case is maybe moving to another cluster, or I don't know. But it's interesting. I mean, it's a very it's a very complex set of data, I think. And I agree with your approach that this profile or class approach is what you have to do, because you have many dimensions in order to reduce the complexity of this approach of the amount of variables that you have in citizenship attitudes. But it's complex. I think it's very complex to show the results. Yeah?
It is very complex to show indeed the result. That's true. But so you said, can you repeat it? It was cluster. No, it was a latent class analysis. But then you
latent transition analysis.
Latent transition analysis.
Yes, I think that maybe that could be an approach.
Yes, because what I should mention is actually that this paper is now under review, and I'm basing this presentation on a particular paper. It's now under review.
Oh, okay.
I did get an RNR, a revise and resubmit, but
right.
No reviewer suggested that I use latent
transition
analysis.
Okay. Oh, nice. And do you have maybe a preprint or something that you could share, or maybe the publication is very soon? And
no, and it's not soon. I'm still working on the revisions, and
okay.
I could send indeed the paper to you, but then of course, since this is really just a draft, so I would be asking not to kind of disseminate it further, and to contact me if you want to cite it.
Definitely. Okay. Thank you very much. So I think we're running out of time. We have just a couple of minutes. Well, I think, thank you. I learned a lot. I hope the public as well, because this is a very comprehensive approach to relate country institutions with attitudes. I think it's at the core of the research. I see it very close to the agenda in social cohesion. I think it's also related to this macro, micro data, attitudes, and country characteristics. So I think it's very well suited to this conference. So thank you very much again for being here virtually.
We do have, sorry to interrupt, but we do have maybe 1 or 2 more minutes. I saw, or is it really the time? Is the time really up? I think we have 1 more minute. Or
yes, yeah, one more minute. Yeah.
Okay. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Let me see. I think there are no more. No, I think there are no more questions. So no more. They tell me, the moderator tell me that there are no more questions. So, but maybe if there are some further questions, they can send it to you by email. We can share your email at the conference website. So
I'm happy to answer indeed all kinds of questions that people have, and certainly I'll send my paper to you.
Great. Yeah. Great. Thank you very much again, Jan, for being with us, and hope to see you soon.
See you next year then as well.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.